In the 1970s, there weren't that many people working in color photography. And I decided at the end of the 70s, after all this fundamental work on trying to understand the structure of pictures, I decided to find a subject matter to pursue and in color. The thing that came to mind was consumerism. I went out to department stores and photographed displays, and then I brought those back and printed them 24 times on a sheet of paper. It's always lovely to find out that number 13 you missed, and you're working on a grid and moving the paper up and down. But the funny thing that happened was that you saw this funny collision of two things: the beauty and the ugliness. The ugliness of the glut on the market of so many things, confronting what happens when you make the grid of these many images. It becomes a beautiful color quality to the image. And in some cases, because of the subject matter, like take these sticks, hockey sticks, it becomes this beautiful quality that you wouldn't see in any other kind of form. In this case, we have the living gloves with the cheesy kind of smile of the 70s coming through. And the gloves, I mean, it's speaking so much about our time right now with COVID, having the use of plastic gloves. At this time, you could get all kinds of different colors, which was always an absurd thing of our time. The grid structure then became something that I realized I could use for moving into other subject matter. And I moved then into structuralist issues. Once I had decided or experienced making grids, I realized that I could apply that form to make other pictures and do it in a slightly different way, and again, study what it was to make a photograph. When you're making a photograph and you're setting up, your vantage point is X. What I decided was, what would be interesting is varying the position of the vantage point. Whereas before, on the grids, I was printing individual frames 24 times. In this case, I would shoot a number of images of the same object, in this case, a house, and I would keep changing my vantage point and make a contact sheet of the set of negatives that I got, without knowing what it was going to look like, but trying to vary it with a permutation and combination of a set mathematical formula as to where my vantage point would be. And when it comes out of the processor, that's when you see what you've got. And I was constructing these beautiful structures inside the contact sheet, which really made some really quite beautiful things. Again, the color in it was established because you would choose just the right subject matter and then manipulate it through this action that I would print. After a series of things that I did in that realm, I decided that a particular subject, I could approach a particular subject, a typological study of something, and what I chose to do was to photograph the human body. And choosing to photograph just faces, male genitalia as here, and a series of all the body parts to make a grid. In this case, again, a contact sheet of what it was I was photographing. And again, the isolation of the permutation combination of what a physical body was like, what a face was like, was really quite exciting, especially for the viewer who could come and study, especially young teenage girls who would study male genitalia photograph in a way that they would have no access to in any other situation. Later, I would use some of the devices I learned in terms of the technique of making them to craft other kinds of pictures. You know, most of we artists who are working, trying to make meaning in our work, have particular moments in time that suddenly makes us totally change direction. And I'm realizing that in the later part of the 80s, these two photographs were representing that turmoil that was inside me that I didn't realize till just today coming into the gallery, that I wanted to make different things. And they were still sort of working or harping back to the idea of the grid work that I did. But this is a homage to one of my great mentors, Frederick Sommer. And it's a piece of black paper that I've cut just with an X-Acto knife freehand and printed the base of a rock face and then put the piece over top to act as a mat and then printed again the darker sections of the cutting that I did. And I think my engagement with the ideas of Frederick Sommer, the continual evolution of his work, really gave me the impetus to start trying to think about making something at a higher level of meaning. I didn't quite understand that at the time. I'm realizing it now. In the 1984, I think, I put together the first conference on a symposium on photographic theory. I brought the best theorists in the world to Ryerson to speak. And there's a lot of conflict going on. And I made this photograph a few years later in talking about my critical view of criticism, photographic criticism, in that I blurred, I took the text from books on theory, blurred them by doubling them, and then put them in little squares, put them onto a card, let them change and evolve, much like what Frederick Sommer did with a photograph he made, and much later photographed it, and then made this image. Theoretically speaking, it's one of the few that I've actually titled. So this was the tumultuous time for me trying to figure out what I wanted to do. What would it be that could actually springboard into something that I would see as more significant in the world, talking about who I was in the world, what did I think of the world that I was in. And I chose to go out with a single camera and photograph things in a very straightforward manner until I figured out what I could do of a more meaningful nature. One of the great things that happens in a context like this for an artist, to have a large exhibition space and therefore a large number of photographs from your 50-year career, is that you can begin to understand the relationship between one section of your work and another that you couldn't do in any other situation. I said that I had started photographing the single picture, and that doesn't seem like very revolutionary, but if you think of all of the work that I've shown you so far, nothing was made with just a single picture. So I was suddenly deciding to find out what the single picture could do in terms of representing who I am in the world. What meaning could I make in that single picture? And I went out. I stopped exhibiting. I stopped showing people work. I just decided that I would just fumble along, just making pictures of whatever I saw that was interesting to me, and print a number of them, look at them every month, 100 pictures to see, okay, what's happening here. In 1989, I made this photograph at the London Fair, and it changed many things for me. I mean, the fair was representing this duck as the best duck they had, and I'm looking at it and thinking the duck looks like it's just about ready to keel over. There is an interesting relationship, an ironic relationship between the text, the title, and the duck. And I began to realize that photographs could have this layered meaningfulness by layering elements inside the picture, by finding those layers. In this particular case, it was irony that made it so much more interesting. But it made me think about metaphor, it made me think about pathos, it made me think about a lot of more complicated ideas that one could bring to bear on whatever your subject matter was. And so I began to pursue, where could I find this? And I photographed for about 2 years in southern Ontario. And it was very difficult to find those images that struck a chord with me. So one time, I decided I would just go down to Pittsburgh area and photograph and see what I could see. When I got down there, it was everywhere. I wasn't sure what the it was, but when I saw it, I knew it and I photographed it. And I photographed so many things that were of so much greater interest than those things I had photographed in Ontario up to that point. In other words, I suddenly was seeing something, and I couldn't articulate it verbally yet, but that would come over the next few years of photographing in the United States.